Now it's time to look even further beyond the label and to technology, and a technology that I'm really excited to learn a lot more about, blockchains. So Jesse Baker from Provenance is going to tell us a lot about that. So give Jesse a round of applause, please.
Great. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here to present to such an inspiring room full of people. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and briefly tell you about Provenance and what we're up to. And then we're going to go on a bit of a roller coaster. And hopefully, if I can make you guys as 1% as excited as I am about the future of the internet and its ability to help make this planet more sustainable, I will have succeeded. So I am a supply chain geek, data nerd, and now trying to use my skills to do something good. I was doing a PhD in computer science, which is pretty dry, and so I started a side project called Provenance. Provenance really came about out of my own personal frustration for how little we know about the things we buy. I'm a tech geek, and I felt like technology wasn't quite being as applied as it could do to help us understand more about where our products come from. So Provenance has turned from a project into a social enterprise, and we're a small gang of mostly geeks, helping businesses, mainly in the food and drinks industry, to help use revolutionary new technologies like blockchains to enable supply chain transparency. So through helping businesses, we've developed a platform. And the platform is really about how empowering businesses all along the supply chain to build trust in the claims they make about their products. And trust, I think, is the key theme of my talk today. And it's really the kind of epicenter of the whole thing, which is how can we build a future of trusted supply chain transparency? So I'm going to talk to you about the problem that we're looking at and that many of you in this room are trying to solve. And talk to you a bit about the evolution of trust in the context of that problem, although this could be applied to many areas. I'm hopefully going to try and explain to you what a blockchain is, which is really what many believe to be the next phase for the internet. Some even say the same amount of step change as when we went from no internet to internet. This is really the next phase. And then I've rounded off, hopefully getting a bit more down to ground and give you a practical example of how we at Provenance have applied using blockchains to make supply chains more transparent in the Southeast Asian fishing industry. So let's crack on with the problem. I won't spend too long in this area, but essentially we work with businesses because they are at risk. Opaque supply chains are compromising the morals and health of their customers. To cut a long story short, we don't want to buy products that are made by slaves, and I don't want to eat stuff that's going to kill me. So at the moment, it's pretty darn difficult to prove that that's 100% not the case, and so here, the problem to be solved. There's another aspect to that problem, which is that products that exist on the market today are making lots of claims about themselves. Slavery-free, non-GMO, organic, made in Italy, whatever it might be. And as the market's becoming saturated with many of these claims, it's becoming a little bit complicated to prove their authenticity and really ensure that they can be trusted. So let's talk about trust. So initially, back in the day, let's go back in time, when you were selling something to someone and when you were buying something from someone, you just looked them in the eye and you took their word for it because maybe your families had been trading with each other for years. And that deep looking in someone's eye and trusting what they say is true, I still think is probably the most powerful form of trust there is. And actually today, in many kind of local supply chains, this is still the way people trust each other, which is this is safe for you to eat because I say so and our families know each other or whatever it might be. But as supply chains got more complex and exploded around the world, quite a few centuries ago, we started to need third parties to tell us whether to trust something or not. This has many guises. I mean, audit might be the one we could talk about most, which is there's a guy who's going to go to a factory that's owned by another guy and say that this factory is cool. And then you're going to tell me that that's the case. Because I've got this other person who's impartial, I can now trust that data. And that model is pretty good, and this is where we are now. We use that model to trust information of all sorts flowing through supply chains and about factories themselves. And this is also the premise for certification, which is developing a fantastic standard, and I'm a full fan of all certification, and then auditing against that standard so that you, the consumer, can recognize that that's the case. And this is okay when you've got a factory, an auditor, and you're buying directly from that factory. Where I think things get a bit more complicated, whether some people like to admit it or not, is where there is a gap. So you've got an audited factory, but then it's 2 degrees away from you in the supply chain. Now, this is where it becomes a bit complicated, because you now need the auditor to have the view of all of the products flowing through the chain. Otherwise, how on earth could they actually say that this actually was the thing that I audited? And this starts to become a much more complex problem. And I think this is one of the main reasons why nobody's cracked sort of supply chain transparency or traceability, is because of this need for this third party to have such a huge global view on what is fundamentally a very dynamic system with lots of parties that don't trust each other, that essentially is very, very complex, in fact, even maybe becoming more complex. So this poses a problem. So let's look at that in summary, and then we're going to go off and look at the future. So we've had the village, which is where I look you in the eyes. We've had the industrial age, where a third party says this is cool, rub a stamp on a piece of paper. We use the internet to help make that better, and the internet might even make that even better. But I think we're moving towards a new future for trust, which is where technology can be the broker for trust itself, which is where we really kind of step into the matrix, I guess. Because essentially what this means is technology is now going to become a medium for which we can even trust the data source itself. Let's go there. Okay, so let's talk about certified products. And I think there's a few concepts that I think we can all recognize that technology could bring to this equation in order to make data more valid about information about a product. So we could have rating systems, a bit like TripAdvisor. Don't see why not. We could audit supply chains a bit more peer-to-peer, like something a bit more like Uber. But the thing I want to talk to you today, and the thing I'm most excited about, is the kind of concept of products and their claims being traded, like the cryptocurrency Bitcoin. For those of you who don't know what Bitcoin is, it is a digital currency. But the cool thing about it is you can trade Bitcoin peer-to-peer without a big centralized bank having to look at all the transactions. And Bitcoin is still the most successful application of a blockchain with a market cap of $19 billion. It's certainly a currency that's not to be shooed to the side. And it's blockchains that really are the thing I'm going to focus my attention on, because even though we can see that the internet can help us validate data in a better way, imagine your Airbnbs, your Ubers, I think the thing that's most exciting is this thing where we can take that validated data and track it down a chain without one third party needing to have a global view of the whole system, which has fundamentally been our issue. So it's addressing this. How can we trust verified data if you're 2 steps down the supply chain? And can technology help replace what traditionally we've needed third parties to do there? So let's talk about blockchains. Right, so it's essentially we're looking at the next phase of the internet. And lots of people much smarter than me, like Mark Andreessen, who invented the web browser, think it really is the next phase for how we deal with data through the internet. The Economist called it the great chain of being sure about things, which I quite like. So, on the left, you have some databases. So this could be actors in your supply chain, this could be a certifier or an auditor, and 2 other actors in the supply chain. And at the moment, fundamentally, those databases are not shared. They can share information, but they all control the permission in order to be able to change that data. There's no fundamental sharing method. You can build ways to hash together things, but the reality is this is all siloed. And this is why you need someone to have a huge global view so that their silo can see the whole supply chain. And this is an issue, fundamentally too complicated to crack. What a blockchain does is it creates a universal source of truth. So you can have information about a factory, you can have information from a supplier, you can have the certifiers database, you can have another certifiers database, an auditors database, and you can create a common ground. And this common ground isn't owned by anybody. It's a commons. It's like the internet itself. There's no, like, we're not controlling it. It is just an entity. But what it allows to happen is for all of these different entities to share a data set. It doesn't always have to be public, but it's shared. And the idea is that nobody can change it without consensus from everybody else. So it essentially presents a data registry that beats all previous systems on persistence, security, accessibility, and essentially makes this this shared auditable data layer. So what they're fantastic for is, like we've seen with Bitcoin, is building trust across networks. So I want to give you some cash, but I don't want to have a bank. I need a blockchain. The same can be true for supply chains. I want to give you a product that I've had verified is organic, but I don't want somebody to monitor all of my products flowing through a whole supply chain because there might be 14 chains of custody between me and a supermarket that's in 7 different countries away from where I am now. Let's use a blockchain to track those certificates, tokenize to mass, in order to be able to do traceability from the grassroots down rather than top down. So this is really the way we're going with the future of how we can trust information, which, sure, we still need a third party to validate that data, and we can build on that with existing new exciting technologies like peer review, like satellites. But then once you've got that data, you can then use a blockchain to ensure that data remains trusted and it doesn't get duplicated. Nobody's copy-pasting your certificate about your product. It can be traded like Bitcoin in a way that nobody can corrupt or change. So let's talk about applying this. So at Provenance, we've been applying this to the problem of supply chain transparency. So looking at creating a sort of digital passport for products that uses this public commons infrastructure of a blockchain in order to commit that passport about the product into it in order for it to be trusted down the chain. That doesn't mean provenance is present down the chain, but it means people can trust that file because the very architecture and technology it's sitting on is immutable. Nobody can change it without consensus from everybody. So yeah, we use this to track products. So it could be a kilo of tomatoes, it could be a ton of fish, which I'm going to show you in a minute, or it could be a very swanky bottle of wine. But that digital passport travels with the product and contains the key verified data about it in order for everybody to be able to trust that certificate is valid. So the main users we work with are the actors in the supply chain. So a supplier that might make a claim about the product, like this product is made in Italy, have that claim verified and then store that data in a public chain. We can then track that down the chain through retailer, and ultimately our vision is about building a future for how consumers can trust those claims and interrogate them and understand more about what they mean. So let me give you an example. And I think for us this is still one of the most exciting examples. More recently we've been working on supply chains that are a little bit closer to home and reinforcing trusted chains for UK retailers and brands. But still, for me, one of the most inspiring projects we did actually came driven for the need from a couple of certifiers and auditors. And that was tracking slave-free tuna. So essentially, we worked with a fantastic fishery in the Maluku Islands in Indonesia. And they were really the pinnacle for sustainability, just doing fantastic stuff. NGO on the ground, working there. They were Fair Trade USA certified. They were Pole and Line Foundation certified. They had really the state of the art in terms of auditing. And those fish were fantastic. Like, this is, creme de la creme of sustainable fish you could buy there. And they had a big issue, which is it didn't matter how great what they were doing in that fishery was. For 100 fish that came out of that fantastic fishery, by the time it reached the retailer in the USA, Japan, and the UK, there was thousands of those fish. People were duplicating the claim that their fish had come from this fantastic fishery. So we worked with them in order to use a blockchain, in order to store those claims and eradicate the potential for those claims to be duplicated or falsely claimed at all the different stages along the supply chain. So this involved, at the beginning of the chain, a registration program with fishermen. This was already in existence with the NGO. This isn't anything new. This was just registering who the fisherman is and working with a few other startups on identity and looking at helping that fisherman to manage their catches and their documentation. So we just stored and we gave them essentially a fancy identity on the blockchain to match with that registration program. We then worked together with them in order to help digitize catches. So just using SMS, nothing too crazy. And again, this is already happening on the ground in lots of places. This isn't too radical. So we were working with the fishermen to get them to be able to declare their catches themselves. So like, I caught 2 yellowfin tunas today. This is the time and a GPS location. The NGO were already doing some interesting stuff looking at satellite data in order to be able to verify catches and that people weren't picking up fish from big slave boats that were further out at sea, and also had several programs with tracking vessels. So fantastic stuff going up on the ground, which meant when we got the data into the blockchain, it was pretty darn good. You know, there was some pretty good validity there. Now where the cool thing happens is when we start to go down the chain. So the guy that's further down the chain that's receiving that fish, what we did is we stored those certifications in a blockchain, so they're digital, which meant they can't be duplicated. They're linked to a fish. And so as the fish went down the chain, at the same time, they had to transfer the digital passport for the fish too. And in order to incentivize the whole system, the factory said they would pay a small premium for digitally traceable fish. And there the engine for change started to work, which was that as we could transfer the fish down the chain, just using a blockchain, we didn't need to be present, and that certificate could go down the chain without being duplicated or adding more fish into the equation. So this went all the way down to the end. So tokenizing the mass of a product, linking it to a certificate, and tracking it like a currency like Bitcoin through ultimately what was 14 chains of custody before it left Indonesia. And so ultimately, this is just building on existing system technology programs that are already happening. So the registration programs, the registering of catches that often is in Excel, but that doesn't mean it's not completely incompatible. But the exciting thing was storing these digital certificates in a way that really couldn't be duplicated. And it meant that everybody could know that when they were getting a certificate down the chain, it was the real deal. And it was the technology doing that, not a overarching third party that was chain of custody auditing the whole thing. It was the tech itself that was meaning it couldn't get duplicated. So essentially what this allowed us to do is to join up the whole supply chain using just this common shared universal data layer, which is pretty complicated. You might have some questions in your head like, how do we deal when it goes from fish to can? And actually, that's also where blockchains are pretty cool, because you can put code and rules into blockchains. You can add sort of law, which says that roughly this amount of fish is going to go into roughly this amount of cans. And if it goes out of this kind of margin, then you've got a problem. And that can be programmed into the chain. You don't need somebody to come along and kind of constantly be monitoring that. I mean, I think what's really important to know is, of course, technology is not the silver bullet, and this isn't going to solve everybody's problems. But I think this backbone, this sort of shared universal data layer that allowed everybody to look at the same data and know that they could trust it, really was an amazing thing for particularly this fishery in making sure that the fantastic work they were doing wasn't getting diluted at every single step of this chain. So that's about it. I mean, I think for us, we're on a mission to use new technologies like this to build sustainable futures. Most of the time, if you Google blockchains, you're probably about 90% chance going to find bankers talking about it and how it's going to revolutionize finance. And there are some great sustainability cases hidden in the financial case too. But I think I wouldn't underestimate this technology as a fundamental game changer for how we can trust all kinds of data and what this could do for audit, for certification, for our own understanding of our supply chains. This could enable businesses to come together, share information in a way that they all know nobody is corrupting. And I think we're about to see this is the very beginning of this, but I think we're about to see this accelerate faster than maybe some of us can imagine. Thank you very much.